Best-selling award-winning novelist Sarah Sundin, author of some beloved World War II stories, never had an ambition to write. She was a pharmacist and perfectly happy being a pharmacist. And then she had a dream that wouldn't let her go. She started jotting down her dream story in pencil in a kiddie's notebook, and 6 months later she had written 700 pages.
Welcome to the Joys of Binge Reading, the show for anyone who ever got to the end of a great book and wanted to read the next instalment. We interview successful series authors and recommend the best in mystery, suspense, historical and romance series, so you'll never be without a book you can't put down. You'll find this episode's show notes, a free ebook and lots more information at thejoysofbingereading.com. And now, here's our show.
Hi, I'm your host, Jenny Wheeler, and today on Binge Reading, Sarah talks about her latest daring, dramatic and romantic story, Embers in the London Sky, exploring the war through the eyes of a mother who lost her child and a BBC journalist who knows reporting the truth will take him deep into the flames. She tells all about that vivid dream that started it all and recollects her own family connections with the war we just can't seem to forget. Our giveaway this week is Enemies to Lovers, Clean and Wholesome Romance. If you can't resist a good enemies to lovers story, this one is for you. Details of where to find the links to these books are in the show notes for this episode and in the newsletter that I send out with each podcast. If you want to download the books or just go on the newsletter list, go to the website thejoysofbingereading.com. If you want the books download, make sure you go to the episode that specifically is related to Sarah's podcast. You can support the production cost of the show by buying me a cup of coffee on buymeacoffee.com/Jenny Wheel and then a little X like a kiss. For the cost of a cup of coffee every now and then, you can make a big difference. And remember, if you enjoy the show, leave us a review so others will find us too.
But now, here's Sarah. Hello there, Sarah, and welcome to the show. It's great to have you with us.
Hey, Jenny, it's great to be here.
Sarah, you've been writing these World War II dramas with lots of romance and adventure in them as well since about 2010. But before that, you were a pharmacist. That's what your training was in. I wonder how you made that switch and why you were interested in doing so.
Honestly, I wasn't interested in doing so. I was a pharmacist. I enjoyed my job. I had small children at the time. And one of the beauties of pharmacy was I was able to do a lot of part-time work. So I only worked one day a week and I was able to be at home with my kids. And I thought I had the perfect career. And then I had an idea for a story. It actually came to me in a dream. And I had to write it. I never had anything like that happen to me ever before in my life. I'd always been a reader, and all little girls who love to read imagine themselves writing a book. But I never took it seriously any more than I did becoming a ballerina, and I loved doing ballet. But becoming an author, that was not going to happen. So I never pursued it at all. But pharmacy, I love pharmacy. So I had a story idea, and I had no idea what I was doing. I'd taken 2 classes in English in college because I was majoring in chemistry. So I had no idea what I was doing. I just started writing freehand, literally with a number 2 pencil on my kids' lined paper from school because I didn't want to put it in the computer yet. And I wrote 2 books like that. And then I got involved. I started going to writers' conferences and I joined a writers' group. Learned I was doing everything wrong, but I learned how to fix it. Ended up, I don't want to say discarding my first 2 books, but setting them aside. They will never be published, and that's okay. They did their job. And my 3rd novel, I started submitting that. That was my first World War II novel, actually. And eventually, it took me 5 years of rejection letters, but eventually I got a contract, and that was my first published novel, A Distant Melody. And no, I can't believe it, but I have 16 novels out. It's been a wild ride.
I do have to follow up by asking you about that dream. Just give us a very quick idea of what the dream was.
Oh, it was wild. There was a young man in the hospital and he'd been in a coma and he woke up and the woman he was in love with was there, but neither of them knew they were in love with each other. And she ends up blurting out how much she loves him. And he's too drugged up after his accident to really respond. But something about those two characters and their dilemma and this sudden declaration of love just got me. And that day, after I had that dream, I woke up and I had 3 little kids. My youngest was still in diapers. So I was running the carpool for the oldest and taking the middle one to preschool and washing diapers with a third one. And the story idea was going and going, and the characters were developing, and I was picturing scenes and dialogue was in my head. And suddenly I had subplots and side characters. And I knew enough about books to know it was a novel. And it was actually rather a disorienting experience because it never happened to me before. And here was this full form novel in my head. And all I knew, I liked it enough that I had to get it down. I loved those characters, and the dialogue was just, the banter was just zinging in my head. And I wanted to record it so I didn't lose it. So it was a weird thing. As I said, that book will never get published. It has so many problems with it, but I still have a very soft spot in my heart for it because it got me started and it showed me. I wrote that entire novel. The rough draft was 700 pages. 700 pages. Ridiculous. And I wrote that all in 6 months by hand during naps and karate practice and ballet practice. And I don't know what else I was doing then. I even remember scribbling down a scene while we were standing in line at Disneyland. It was almost this manic experience where the story had just taken over and I had to get it down. It's never been like that since. Since then, lots of story ideas, but not this just obsessive need to get the story down. But I'm convinced now it was God's way of getting me started on it because I needed a kickstart. Because there's no way I would have, if I'd had an idea, gee, I should write a novel, and it never would have happened. So I needed that intense experience to get me started.
Do you think that some of the aspects of the characters and themes may have carried over into some of your other books? Are there bits of them that have become valuable or useful as you've gone along?
It's mostly, I think, all first-time authors. Most of us, our very first novel, the hero or the heroine is very much like us. And as you begin to write more and more, you realize you can't write all your novels with your heroes or heroines with your type, your personality and all your experiences and stuff like that. And so this novel actually had lots of characters in it. And it was this group of friends. And there were about a dozen really strongly formed characters in that novel. And they were all very different. So it taught me to write from experiences and personality types that weren't my own. That experience of doing it and getting comfortable writing in another person's head, that's what carried me over. The characters themselves, I don't think so. The heroine was a nurse, and I ended up having a series about nurses, but she was her own person and she hasn't carried over. I did end up using the heroes. I vowed I would never, his first name was Tom, and I vowed I would never have another Tom because he was the only Tom. I ended up having a Tom in my 4th published novel. So nothing about them was truly sacred there, but they're still very precious to me because they got me started in this crazy business.
And it sounds as if they are real people to you.
Your characters really become real to you. They're fully fleshed. I liken it to getting to know a friend. So I meet this character and think, oh, that's an interesting person. I want to write about them, but I only know little bits and pieces about them. I need to have it all set up before I start my rough draft. So during the outlining process, I'm interviewing them. I'm giving them personality tests. I'm filling out my plot chart. I have a spreadsheet that I fill out. And as I'm doing this, they become more and more, I almost think it's like it starts off like a pen and ink drawing, and then it becomes like a watercolor or an oil painting. And then when I'm writing the rough draft, then it becomes animated. Then they become really real. So it's like getting to know a friend. And the more you know that friend, you find new parts to them and you get deeper, and you'll have a friendship that you've had for a long time. And suddenly your friend will say something like, I didn't know that about you. And my husband and I have been married for 30 years, I think. And he said, yeah, I always wanted to be an engineer. I said, no, you didn't. You said, told me you want to be a physician. He says, I did, but originally I wanted to be an engineer, but I forgot about you. And our son's an engineer. So I would have thought that would have come up earlier in our marriage, but it never had. So still after 30 years of marriage, I'm getting to know my husband. And it's a similar process with the characters. I feel like I'm getting to know a friend. And with each chapter, I dig a little deeper and find out more about them.
That's lovely. We must get on to talking about your latest book. But just before we do, because you mentioned the word GOD, and you are an inspirational fiction author. So just tell us a little bit about that aspect. How does that fit into your book?
I write Christian fiction. I am a Christian. So the way I see it is we talk about a worldview. So we all have a worldview, how we envision the world works. And as a Christian, I see God as very interactive with us, with the world around us. And so my characters interact with God. So they pray to God, they learn about God, they learn about themselves, they learn about how they've erred and their sins and how they need to change. And God, in a way, I don't want to call him a character in the novel, but he's always present. And just the way I see the view with a hopeful ending, as opposed to a lot of the dystopian stuff that's, oh, the world's falling to pieces and it's only going to get worse. And I tend to have a more of a hope-filled viewpoint because of my relationship with God. So I can't imagine not writing that way with God being part of the world, because I can't imagine a world without God in it.
That's lovely. But you don't particularly try and evangelize in your books, do you?
No, I don't. Now I have 3 characters who become Christians during the novels that I just finished. That'll be coming out in 2025. She has a come to faith moment. But in general, my characters are people who are already Christians and they're learning how to be Christian, because none of us are perfect and we're all works in progress and growing in our journey. And ironically, I should say, it's very much keyed into who I am as a Christian. I do a lot of teaching. So I teach women's Bible studies. I teach Sunday school to 4th and 5th graders. So what I do within the church is I'm basically working with people who are generally already Christians and helping them grow in their walk. So my characters, I have the same impact on their lives. I, as the author, am helping them grow in their walks with God. Though as I said, I have had a couple of characters who were definitely not believers at the beginning of the stories, and they do come to faith. I try not to do the sermon and the character falling to their knees, and I try not to do like a conversion scene. I think my favorite one, the hero is actually, he's a pilot in the sky above us, and he's just messed up, and his whole life is messed up. And he's actually cussing. I don't show the cuss words on the page, but he is cussing and cussing. And something, I can't remember what it was, he says to himself, but he just realizes that God is the answer, and that because he'd been raised in the church, he just never believed it. And he actually hits the cockpit and starts bleeding, and it was the thought of the blood of Jesus. But then I cut to black, and then I show him a little later. But I actually have my conversion scene with him cussing up a storm in the cockpit of his P-51 Mustang.
In the Second World War, that was probably a pretty vulnerable place to be.
It really was.
Let's talk about Embers in the London Sky, which is the latest one of your book. You do promise that they're dramatic, that they're daring, and that they're romantic, and they are. So this one traces 2 key characters. The leader is a mother trying to find her child who was lost in a chaotic scenes in the middle of a German bombing raid, and who is a BBC war correspondent. They meet, and Hugh starts to try and help her to find her son. I admit that I didn't really think much about the way that children would have obviously got lost during a chaotic war scene. And you make it clear in the notes at the back of your book that this was a very real thing. Tell us a little bit about the numbers that were affected in this way.
I'm afraid I actually don't have numbers on that, and I'm not sure we'll ever get those. There were so many people who were displaced during the war. And after the war, there were just millions of people on the road, and people being released from the concentration camps, people who've been bombed out of their houses all throughout Europe, and soldiers who are trying to get back home. So there were just millions of displaced people in Europe. But this story takes place early in the war during the invasion of the Netherlands and Belgium and France. And there were at least well over 1 million people on the road as the Nazis invaded. And there were instances where parents who were on foot were desperate for their children and would thrust them into cars, thinking that at least their child had a better chance to get away in a car than they would on foot. And then after the war, or after the invasion, everything settled down and people were going back home. This is mid-1940, and they couldn't find their children. And the newspapers in Paris were filled with their classified ads are filled with people trying to find their children. And that broke my heart as a mom. And that's how that one inspired that story. I don't know any numbers of how many people were separated because of the chaos of war. I don't know if there are any numbers. Later on in the story, I mentioned some numbers in Britain where they evacuate the children from the cities to the countryside. And in the first couple days of the war, they evacuated 1.5 million mothers and children to the countryside, which is a phenomenal logistical feat. They basically took over the railway system and just filed on all the schools went in together, and mothers with young children came together, and 1.5 million people. It's rather incredible feat because of what we call the phony war or the Boer War, where after the defeat of Poland, the Western Front pretty much went quiet until April and May of 1940 when the Germans went on the move with the Blitz again. So there was this period of about 7-8 months where there really wasn't much happening. And all these children who had been evacuated to the countryside, and their parents said, their children are miserable. We're miserable not having them with us, and their bombs aren't falling. So let's bring our kids home again. And so all throughout the war, there was this tension between the families who wanted to be together and the government, which really wanted the children in safety so they weren't going to get killed in bombing raids. And so there was this constant tension. And as things got worse, they would have another campaign to get the children to evacuate. And then things would quiet down and the children would come home. And so all throughout the war, it wasn't like children evacuated on September 1st, 1939 and didn't come back till VE Day. There was this back and forth. And I found that very interesting.
Yeah, I guess there must have been some children who were never reunited with their families, even if their parents were still alive. It just would be the case, wouldn't it?
Yes. Yeah, even in Britain, some of these children came from bad homes to begin with. And so, their parents really didn't mind having them out of the house. And some of them actually became very bonded to their evacuee homes in the countryside. And the foster families really loved their kids. So there were some situations where the kids would either not go home again or some would run away and try to go back to the countryside. But for everyone who did that, there were children who ran away from the country and went back to London because they wanted to be with their families. There was just so much going on. And especially a lot of these lower income families, the parents both were working, and oftentimes they depended on the school-age children to watch the little ones. So when the school-age kids were evacuated, that put a hardship on the families. So they wanted those kids back for the childcare. So there were so many things that go on, and we see these images of the children getting on the trains, and we think, oh, it's sad, but thank goodness they're being safe. But when you actually dig into it, imagine what the children were going through. Imagine what the families were going through. Imagine what the foster families are going through in the countryside. And suddenly you have children in your home and they're homesick and maybe they're wet in the bed and they have behavior issues that you're not used to because they're city kids and you're a nice, clean country family. So there was this culture clash, and some of the foster families were really willing to have the kids. They were super excited and very compassionate. And others some were neglectful, some were abusive because people are people. And so there's this broad range of things that happen to the children. And that's what I wanted to show in the novel as Aleda gets involved working with the Ministry of Health, which was responsible for the evacuations. And as she's starting to talk to these evacuees, and she's talking to the families back in London, and she's talking to the foster families and the billeting officers who are responsible for keeping everything together in the countryside. And so she's starting to see these issues. and it opens her mind. It helped her learn more compassion as she's watching these people go through it. And it was a way to help her grow as meanwhile she's looking for her son.
Yeah. So that's definitely a very important part of the story. The other part is obviously Hugh and the whole scene with the covering of the war correspondence. At this stage of the war, the US had not actually entered action, but there was some very important US correspondents sending postings from London, telling the American population what was happening. Give us an idea of why they were so important.
Well, America was obviously geographically isolated. This was before TV. Radio was actually a very new medium. This was the first war that was covered by, first major war that was covered by radio. World War I, there was no radio. And which I don't know why it struck me as, oh, I didn't know that, but I didn't know that. And so it was a new medium. And the radio correspondents and the radio broadcast stations were still learning how to use this new medium. Well, the BBC was really very much a premier organization. They were really the first big radio station, and they had done a lot of technological advances and the first ones to do outdoor broadcasts as opposed to being in the studio with the perfect soundproof room and all that. So they were doing a lot of technological and broadcasting innovations. They'd started TV before the war, which surprised me again. I think of that as really much a post-war thing, but they actually had TV broadcasts before the war. They had to stop during the war. But meanwhile, America, of course, the BBC, Britain, they have one broadcasting company, the BBC, and the entire country gets that. And they had some regional, in America, we call them channels, but they had regional stations too, but they were all part of the BBC. Now in America, partly because it's geographically so widespread, but also because of this capitalistic, free enterprise, anything goes atmosphere, there are radio stations everywhere. There are multiple networks. There were small local broadcast companies that were just their own in Podunk, wherever. And then you had the big networks like NBC and CBS and Mutual. And so it was definitely a Wild West atmosphere and a lot of competition. And of course, competition means innovation. So there were a lot of American innovations too. But where it became really important during the war was Edward R. Murrow with CBS was a very popular correspondent. He had an amazing voice, just beautiful, deep timbre, and he had a way of speaking in simple and profound sentences, short and sweet and deep. And he went to London, and because he didn't have the same censorship over him as the BBC correspondents, he was able to do some more things than the BBC correspondents were able to do. He did some live broadcasts. The BBC correspondents weren't allowed to do some of that early in the war because those broadcasts could be picked up in Germany. So if they're talking about bombs falling in Trafalgar Square, then the Luftwaffe can say, aha, our bombs hit Trafalgar Square. Good job on the navigation, or let's switch. We were off a little bit on our navigation. So they could use those live broadcasts to improve their navigation. So they had to do delayed broadcasts. But the situation was different in America. There's this very famous recording of him in Trafalgar Square during a bombing raid, and you can hear the air raid sirens. And he pauses. He doesn't just talk the whole time. He pauses and picks up those noises. He puts his microphone down to the ground and hears the footsteps of the people on their way to the air raid shelter. And he's commenting, they're not running. They're walking very slowly because they've got that beautiful Blitz spirit, the calm spirit of the British. And these broadcasts were heard in America. Before then, the American people were split about whether or not they wanted to join the war. But his broadcast helped push him over the edge because they saw Britain with the bombs falling and they felt it. And they felt those people, their despair. They also really heard their courage. And it really helped tip the public opinion toward the Allies and toward joining the war. Obviously, it wasn't until Pearl Harbor that America joined the war. But this type of thing helped Roosevelt pass the Lend-Lease bill, which was vital to helping Britain fight the war. It was incredible. So I was able to be a part of it. So here's Hugh, who's a BBC correspondent. He's trying to record, but he has some limits on him. And censorship isn't the right word because the government wasn't telling the BBC what they had to broadcast, but they were allowing them to self-censor. But they were being very careful because they didn't want to give any comfort to the Germans. He was pushing back against these limits that are on him, getting to these wonderful debates with an appropriate level of discretion. And meanwhile, I have Edward R. Murrow in a couple of scenes and showing his broadcasts to show what an international city London was during the war and how the British, especially how the Blitz, really helped persuade the Americans that the Allied side was the right side, the only side to be on.
We will get the links because some of those broadcasts are still available on the web today, aren't they? I'm sure that
Yes.
people would love to hear some of those. So I'll make sure that I get the links from you and we'll put them in the show notes for this episode. You do have you a little later on covering an invasion in Norway, and that was where he was able to do a live broadcast. And also there is the scene where one of the Free French broadcasters who evacuated from Paris when the Germans took over is blamed because he mentions a particular ship, which is then later sunk by the Germans, and he's blamed for giving them the ship's location in a broadcast. Tell us a bit about those two episodes.
The situation with the French reporter, I made that up, but similar things did happen. There was a situation where the allies of the British and the Free French went to Dakar in Sierra Leone, and they were trying to invade there because it was run by the Vichy French, and the Free French wanted to take it over. And there were French sailors heard in the bars talking about Dakar, and Vichy were ready for them. And so there was a lot of talk about, oh, some spies must have heard it, or it was broadcast. And so there was the sense of, oh, this information got to the Germans. So there was always that concern. The European services of the BBC, which was like a division of the BBC, and that was really very freewheeling too, because they were all separate departments and they didn't fall completely under the BBC. A lot of them were self-governing. They had some British BBC personnel involved, but the French section had a lot of Free French reporters. There were a lot of pushing back with all these different nations with their own stations broadcasting to occupied Europe. As far as the Lofoten raid, which was in Norway, it was a one-day raid for in March, April 1941. And there was a small group of Norwegian and British commandos who went to this Lofoten Islands in Norway, and they just came in, completely surprised the Germans. There was only a small garrison there. Took all the Germans prisoner, took them back to England, took all the Quislings, the Norwegian traders, they took them back to England, and they took a bunch of Norwegian patriots who wanted to fight for the Allies and volunteered, and they came back to England and they were able to fight. And they destroyed all these fish oil factories that were used to help make ammunition for the Germans. And so it was a big morale booster. There were some problems and I didn't cover this in the book because they didn't actually clear it with the Norwegian government in exile, and they were not happy with it. Because there were some repercussions when the Germans came back to the Lofoten Islands. They imprisoned a lot of people, put a lot of people in concentration camps. So there were some really bad repercussions, which, of course, Hugh would not have known about. This was not something he would have even heard about. But it was a great big morale booster in England. And he actually records. He can't record live because he is in Norway and there's no way for them to broadcast live from Norway. But he records it on disc. But he's recording it live. And then they take the discs back and they were able to play it later. And that sense of live coverage where you can hear the sounds. And there was an actual Crown film unit. So there is some video footage of that raid. And I used that as a source for Hugh's report. And I have links to that broadcast and to a couple of Edward R. Murrow's broadcasts on my website. And I'll give you both of those links after this. But it was really interesting to watch.
The last few books you've done have been standalone novels, but before that, you did a number of series. And I just want to mention them, especially to American readers if they are interested in this period, because you have one called Sunrise at Normandy, which is about three brothers who in various ways are linked through the D-Day landings, and another called Wings of Glory, as you mentioned, the B-17, three brothers who flew in the B-17 bombers. So you've also got one about nurses. And so you do cast a light on the American involvement in the war in a way that perhaps some other writers haven't done, haven't you?
Yeah, and that's where I started. Since I am an American, I very much have an American voice, and it seemed very natural. The Wings of Glory series, I actually had the brothers coming from the town where I was living. Made it an easy way for me to get their voices down. As I've been writing more and more, the last four novels, the standalones, some of them have had European main characters, like Embers in the London Sky. We have a Dutch refugee and we have a British man. I had some American side characters, but I didn't have any American main characters, which is the first time I've done that. I've had a couple of other my books, I've had European main characters. Next two books on this contract, it's not a series, but they're loosely related. They're three Dutch cousins. So the next book is about Aleda's cousin Scylla, and the next one about her cousin Garrett. And then there are the Scottish hero in the next book and a heroine from the island of Jersey in the third book.
You have a personal family link to the war as well, don't you? Tell us a little about that.
So my grandfather was in the U.S. Navy. He was what they called a pharmacist mate. Now they call them hospital corpsmen, or a medic, basically. So he was taking care of people in hospitals, and he was on Guam. And so he was a storyteller, and his brother, oh my, he was a character. And he was a B-17 bomber pilot, which is why I had my first series, all of these brothers who were B-17 bomber pilots. His B-17 flew into Pearl Harbor during the attack, which was incredible. And he then flew a tour of duty from Australia and finished that tour of duty, and then flew another tour of duty from England with the 8th Air Force. So he had quite the career. He ended up at the end of the war, he was in Eisenhower's headquarters with the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. It's a long mouthful. So he had quite the career. And my other grandfather was unable to fight. He had a heart murmur from rheumatic heart disease as a child, but he was a professor of German and he was a native German speaker. So he was able to use his German language skills to help train American soldiers to go in after the occupation and do everything from interrogate prisoners to help displace people. He was using his skills for the Allied cause, which is really, I love that.
Yeah, that's terrific. Look, we've had a good talk about these books, and we're starting to run out of time a little bit. So just turning to Sarah as reader, tell us what you like to read for your personal pleasure, and if you've got anything you'd like to recommend to listeners.
Oh my goodness. Of course, every writer loves to read. I am super behind on my reading right now. I've had a little bit of a family crisis the last few months, and so I have barely done any reading at all except my basic research to get my novel written. I'm halfway through Holly Varney's book called On Moonberry Lake, which is absolutely delightful. And I've said that in every interview I've done for this book in the last 3 months because I've been reading it so slowly. I've had almost no free time, but I'm enjoying Holly's book. And it's fun because she's a friend. I met her at writers' conferences long before she was published. So it's fun to see her being published.
When you do have a little bit of time, what does your taste extend to?
Oh, I end up, well, because of being a published author, I get a lot of requests to read World War II books, especially for endorsement. And World War II is very popular right now. So I'm reading a lot of World War II fiction. If it were just me, I would read a lot of historical fiction from a variety of eras. I love time traveling, if you will, in a novel. But I also like contemporary books. I like the occasional fantasy novel or thrillers. I just like to try different things. But a lot of my reading right now is almost, I don't want to say assignments because it makes it sound like it's miserable, but it's more, I need to read this book for endorsement. So I have a lot of books to read for endorsement right now.
You probably read it from a point of view where your judgments are a little bit more succinct in that area than just the average reader because you know so much about the period. Do you find sometimes that you're finding yourself saying, oh, I know that's not right?
Yeah. Most of what I find now, the level of research for novels has become such a high bar. The work that's being done by historical novelists right now is phenomenal. In general, I would say 90% of the books I read that are World War II, I can say, wow, they really did the research. I can tell. It's the detail, the big details, the little details, just the knowledge, that deep knowledge of the era. And I'm just seeing such a wonderful depth and knowledge of the knowledge base. So that thrills me. Where I do see errors, every once in a while I'll read one where I can tell they have not done their research. They've read 2 or 3 books and try to write a book from those books usually don't get an endorsement. I may enjoy the story, but I personally can't endorse it. What I will notice is occasional minor things, and they're so minor that only people like me are going to pick up on them. And it's also the type of thing that I know I make the same type of minor errors in my book because sometimes it's not about what you know or what you don't know, but knowing what questions to ask. Sometimes you don't know the question to ask. I'll use my mother's example. My mother was very upset reading a novel, a historical novel, where the heroine is applying mascara and she's using a mascara wand. And my mother was incensed. She says, oh, they didn't have mascara wands back then. They had a little pot and you dipped your finger in. And so she's describing how they did it. And I was stunned because I've always used a mascara wand. It never occurred to me that there was any other way to apply mascara. So for me, if I was writing a historical character and I wanted to have her apply mascara, before I talked to my mother, I would have had her using a wand because it never occurred to me to ask that question, how did you apply mascara in 19XXX? So unless you ask that question, you may not find the answer. So a lot of these are very minor questions. I saw one where it was a novel set in Germany during the war, and the heroine is wearing bright red lipstick. And I just researched a novel set in Germany. I was like, oh no, she couldn't do that. The Nazis had outlawed makeup. So she definitely wouldn't have had bright red lipstick. She might have some powder that she'd hidden away, but she wouldn't dare wear bright red lipstick. But if you hadn't thought to ask that question, you wouldn't know that was a thing. So those types of things, when I read them in a novel, I chuckle to myself and I don't say anything. I'm not going to contact the author. It's such a minor thing. And there are only 3 people in the world who'll catch it. And most of us know that it's so minor, it's not worth it. But yeah, it does change how you read.
Yeah. Look, it's probably possible that once that book is published, one of her readers will tell her that.
Oh, gosh. Yes. And when I make an error, and I make at least one, because I'm sure there are way more errors in there that people just aren't catching and not contacting me. But at least one glaring error in each novel. And that's God's way of keeping me humble. And there was one, and I'd gotten the conversion of British money, English money at the time, these shillings and pence. And it doesn't make any sense to me as an American at all. I read, that's nonsense. It's crazy stuff. And I had found in a book, ironically, a book I bought at the Imperial War Museum that had the conversion. And I used that. British reader of a certain age has contacted me and said, Sarah, I loved your book. However, and I said, I know, I got the wrong number of shillings to a crown. But I did one reader who said, I can never trust you again. I will never read your books again. I can't trust you. And I felt awful. I made a mistake. And I was thinking how many facts I'd had in that book, and I had one wrong. And I was a little ticked off at that one. But on the other hand, I know how people are, and you get something wrong like that, and you violate their trust. So I messed that one up. It's been fixed now in the more recent versions. But yeah, so we're human. We make mistakes.
What is next for Sarah as author? Just give us an idea of what you are working on over the next 12 months.
I just turned in my next novel. I have a title, but we haven't released it yet. But it's set in Scotland during the war. And she is a Dutch refugee who actually to escape, she becomes a German spy and thinks that she's going to ditch the Germans the second she lands in England. But she gets captured immediately by a kilt-wearing Scotsman who is a naval officer, and he turns her in. And MI5 turns her to become a double agent. And she's immediately set up to Scotland to send false messages back to Germany about British ship movements, and she's assigned a naval liaison who is the same man who captured her. So it's been a fun story to write. So that one's been turned in. I'm waiting for my edits on that. And then I'm getting started on my next book, which will be set on the island of Jersey during the war. So that'll be fun, the Channel Islands.
So that one you've just mentioned, what was the nub idea for that? Was there really someone who did come to England as a German spy and then turned?
Yeah. The MI5 had what they call the double cross system, and there were about 36 German spies. I shouldn't say German because most of them were other nationalities, but they were sent by Germany. And so there were Dutch, Norwegians, Spaniards, French, Poles, Czechs, and Germans, Belgians, and they would send them to England. And MI5 actually captured all of the German agents who were sent to England except one. And that one ran out of money and committed suicide, so he did no harm at all. But they would turn them, become double agents. Those who wouldn't turn were either imprisoned or executed. But some of the agents who came were like my heroine Scylla, who actually were not Nazis and were using the German Abwehr as a free ticket to England to get out of occupied Europe. So there were some that were allied with resistance. Most of them were pretty sketchy characters, but those things happened. And the nucleus of that idea actually was my youngest son is very much into mythology. And when I told him I want to write something set in Scotland, he says, "Oh, Mom, you should use some of the mythology." And so he started telling me about the legend of the Selkie, which is a mythological creature which looks like a seal, but when she comes to land, she strips away her seal skin and she's a beautiful woman. And the men see her, immediately fall in love with her, but she wants to go back to the sea. So the way they can capture her and keep her is to hide her seal skin, and then she's trapped on land and she has to stay. And when he told me that story, I was immediately picturing this agent landing at night, and her seal skin is the rubber dinghy that she's come with. And, this Scotsman captures her, and by stealing her boat, she's trapped. But actually, of course, I had to make her a sympathetic heroine. She obviously can't be a Nazi. She has to be an allied. So that was the nucleus of that idea, this image of this woman landing by boat at night and this man capturing her. And that became the scene that drove that novel. Every novel for me has, a big scene that I'm either working toward or that drives the novel. And that was the scene for me.
We should now finish because we have run over time, although it's been so fascinating. We'd just like to know, do you enjoy interacting with your readers, and where can they find you online?
You can find me on my website at sarahsundin.com. Subscribe to my email newsletter. And I'm also on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or X, or whatever we're calling it this week. Come find me.
That's wonderful. Look, thanks so much, Sarah. It's been fascinating.
Thanks. Same to you. Bye.
Next time on Binge Reading, and that's in 2 weeks' time, remember, on April 23, we have author Amy Harmon. Amy grew up in a remote valley very close to where the famed outlaw Butch Cassidy lived, and she's always been fascinated by the folklore around his Robin Hood reputation. She's far too young to have seen that famous movie starring Paul Newman and Robert Redford first time round, but she's excavated the history and sheds a whole new light on the story in her latest book. The Outlaw Noble Salt is released today, and it's a remarkable story that one critic says imbues the Butch Cassidy myth with even more passion and intrigue. It could have fallen flat if it hadn't been handled with care, he says, but lucky for readers, Harmon is well up to the task. That's next time on Binge Reading. And just a final housekeeping reminder before I go. Support us by buying me a coffee and by leaving a review. Word of mouth is still the best way for readers to find books they will love to read. That's it for today. See you next time, and happy reading.